Hi everyone, this is George from For Music, and in today's episode of For Music's soundtrack podcast, I'm very happy to welcome John Graham, who's a fantastic composer from the United States, known not only for his music for a couple of well-known franchises, but also from his participation in the community, if I may say, because John, you've been really a very helpful member across many communities, and I've actually received personally very insightful tips from your side. So yeah, welcome here.
Thank you very much, George. Nice to be here.
It's our pleasure entirely. We've worked together on a very grandeur project for it's the national television of Japan, right?
Yeah, NHK. Yeah. So I've recorded with the team in Sofia now. I don't know how many times, weeks of recording, and probably 10 hours of music by now. And I keep going back because the musicianship is really excellent. The score preparation, if you know a lot, I've been doing this a long time. I actually know a lot about how to prepare a score. But if you don't know anything, they can still work with you. They can orchestrate for you. They can copy all the parts. But I guess for me, the reason I keep going back is there's just top quality all the way around. The musicianship, the conducting, the people in the booth, they have an excellent board. They have awesome microphones. And so I like that. But maybe the most important thing is just the attitude of whatever it takes to get the job done. And I guess that, to me, is one of the most important things about being a composer. You kind of have to just ignore obstacles, get past them, go around them. And I feel like the people in George's team for music, they really understand that, and they get everything done on time.
Oh, that's really kind of you to say. Yeah, also working in this industry, I know that being on time is often more important than writing good music.
Well, it doesn't help if your music is great, but it's a month late.
Yeah, but
so that's definitely part of it. But the other thing is that there's a lot of tension. Everybody is under a lot of pressure. The conductor, the players, they're looking at music they've never seen before. Sometimes it's really quite difficult. And that's something we should talk about, George, is like the level of difficulty and how to make something that sounds really difficult be a little easier to play. We could maybe talk about that. Yeah. But I guess the other thing is just in general, with all that tension and all that pressure, you really want to be around pretty decent people and people who understand we're all working together, but everyone's trying as hard as he can. And even when there are mistakes or problems, because inevitably there are, honestly, being a good fellow is pretty useful in the entertainment business.
Yeah, and often that's not the attitude that you come across normally when you work, especially on tight deadlines and TV shows. And going back to the Japanese project that we did, Awaiting Kirin, right? That's the English.
Yes. Yeah, you can translate it a number of different ways. In Japanese, it's Kirin ga Kuru, and it's part of the taiga drama that has been on since 1963.
This is the
every year
59th.
Yeah. Every year, NHK, which is the national broadcaster of Japan, it's like the BBC of Japan, chooses an historical figure from Japanese history, and they make 40 or 50 episodes out of that person. And they're full-length episodes. They're 45 minutes to 50 minutes. So there's an absolute ocean of music about it. There's an ocean of music. But the other thing is that people really care. It's a very, very popular show because it's on Sunday nights, so it's really for families. And they don't want avant-garde, let me show you what a genius composer I am. They want music that is sort of reaches people, that talks to people and meets them where they are. So there are old people watching the show, there are children watching the show. And even though the show can be quite dramatic with a lot of death and violence, most of it's off screen. You don't see a lot of chopping off of limbs or something on the screen. It's a very discreet show. But nevertheless, it's very serious. And of course, because it's an important person in Japanese history, it's meaningful to the audience.
And it's quite the important role that you have, because I suppose that 58 seasons before that, there were different composers, so some sort of a style.
Yeah. They change composers every year. And they've only had a couple of Westerners do it before. So there was a lot of stress at their end, honestly, hiring for the first time an American to work on the show. And then we had, of course, COVID, and we had to work around that. But luckily, we were able to come up with an approach that had a lot of melody, that had a lot of drama and intensity to it, but it was nevertheless very approachable music and honestly just sort of enjoyable music for people of all ages. And that's where we ended up. And but we recorded for weeks in Sofia to get it all together, and it just came out beautifully.
Yeah. And I've heard a bunch of those, finished already tracks. I know of 3 soundtracks, like 3 albums that are put at least on.
Well, they put out 3 albums, and then they put out a best of, and then they put out a multi-disc set with 6 CDs in it. And the show itself was very, very popular, and the music turned out to be popular too, which
nice.
was really gratifying. But I was really trying my absolute best to be kind of a good guest of Japan. I really admire Japan. I admire the effort that the people at NHK put in on this show, because it's clearly a labor of love. You can tell from the cast of the show that the show is meaningful to people in Japan. Many of the most famous actors in Japan, and honestly, some of the best actors you'll see, are on the Kirin shows or on the taiga drama shows, because they're so meaningful to people in Japan. And so they're meaningful to the actors as well.
Yeah. And you have a strong connection to Japan. Is it right? You've worked on Devil May Cry, you've worked on Final Fantasy, so these are...
Yeah. I have. I really enjoyed working with people in Japan for a lot of different reasons. One of them is they're very serious and very professional, but people there are courteous, and they really focus on a team and making sure everybody understands what's going on. It's cheerful and collegial in a way that it's not always in the entertainment business, where it's a bit more abrasive. So the Japanese mentality of teamwork is just a fantastic thing for me, and I've really been grateful to the teams I've worked with over there.
Yeah, I suppose it's very organized compared to...
It is very organized, but it's also, people, there's a level of candor and courtesy that you don't always find. For example, if you hear of jobs all the time in other locations where if they don't like the first thing they hear, you get fired, or you get dressing down or some kind of thing like that. But you never get that with the Japanese teams. The Japanese teams will say, well, we like that, but it's not quite what we had in mind, and so can you do it a little bit more this way? So it's just very collegial, and it invites creativity rather than fear and anxiety, which is a real creativity killer, I think, and something that you do find in other places where you don't have that level of collegiality.
Yeah, just today I was speaking with some of my colleagues here at the studio, and we were talking about. Do you know the soundtrack for Troy?
Sure.
Yeah, but not the James Horner one, the one that got rejected.
Oh, the one that got thrown out.
Yeah, which is actually pretty nice music, and it's...
Yes, it is.
I would, personally, I think it's better than the one that got out with the film. And this is actually a very hard position to be in, because you're putting a lot of work into it, and it's a creative work, and suddenly it gets thrown out. Does it get too often in LA?
I would say that was this very spectacular example of someone going all the way down and actually recording the score. So they didn't just do demos or mock-ups or electronic versions. They actually went all the way to record the expense and time of recording an orchestral score and then mixing it. And only then did the powers that be on that project decide they wanted something different. So they went to a guy who's won an Academy Award, James Horner, and who is certainly a very, very well-known composer and knows what he's doing. And they also changed creative direction pretty violently. And I guess you do hear stories like that. That one was pretty extreme. The most extreme story I ever heard was a composer who went to the premiere of a film. He's sitting there with his wife and friends, and the credits come up, and instead of his name, it's somebody else's name. Oh. And he's sitting there totally humiliated. So there are crazy things that happen. Anyway, none of that kind of thing with Japan.
With Japan.
And I felt, I always feel that there's this open communication and just a very comfortable way of working. But also the composer, you have to kind of do what you think is right for the project. So sometimes you'll get directions that, so this is sort of changing subject slightly and not so much about particular to Japan. Sometimes you get instructions on a project and you think, wow, that's really a terrible idea. So let me give you one example. I worked on a little vignette, really, a kid's movie, and the music supervisor called me and said, the composer's tried something. We've had all kinds of temp music. Nothing works. But the one thing we know we don't need is circus music from a circus. That's what we don't want. So I look at the scene. I say, okay, no circus music. I look at the scene. I think that scene needs circus music. So I said, I promised I wouldn't write circus music, but of course I did write circus music because I thought that's what the scene needed, and they loved it. So that's a great example of where maybe my idea of what circus music is and theirs is completely different. I don't really know, but you have to believe in yourself as a composer. And for me, one of the things I love about the taiga drama series and the Japanese jobs I've had is that they want sincere music. They want to know what you think. They want to hear the ache when there's something sad. They want to hear the excitement when there's drama. They want you to put love into it when it's a scene about love. Sure. So I do think that it's super important to be yourself, put yourself out there, take risks creatively, because if you never do that, then what are you really putting out there? If people love your music, you want them to love what's really sincere about you, not something that's kind of put on or affected.
Yeah, that's a good advice. Yeah, at the end. Because nowadays, especially with sample libraries, where you get, especially the ones that have full-on performances, where you press a key and then you get a certain style of music performed. So this, in a way, it allows for a quicker workaround, but also gives us music that is more, I would say, generic, or it doesn't surprise us as listeners.
Right. It doesn't surprise us. That's a great way of putting it, George. And part of what we all go to entertainment for, whether it's a video game or a television show or one of the streaming services or the movies, is a little surprise and a little break from everything that we already have had in our lives.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I guess I've been enjoying is that with all the competition among the streaming networks is the audacity of some of the shows that you see.
Yes.
You see shows that really are honestly kind of weird or take a path that you never would have expected. And they sometimes are willing to do that musically too. I do think it's really helpful for the score to help the show differentiate itself and not just be, one note cues where you put down a drone and just put some cool chords over the top of it. I mean, that works for 30 seconds. That work. You can do a whole score like that if you want to, but it ends up being kind of boring and expected.
One example is now from the point of view of today, I think that we now regard it as some sort of a standard or like a cliche, but I think that Stranger Things, when it came out, all that, 80s, 90s nostalgia, but especially with the score that's very much like Tangerine Dream and, this old aesthetic that wasn't popular, and it completely changed the direction of the music that we listen in today. So a lot of things try to imitate this, and that was basically a streaming service, Netflix, that came out with this weird idea.
Yeah, that's a great example of just taking a crazy chance and doing something that hasn't been done in it maybe ever really exactly the way they did it, but certainly not in decades.
Yeah.
I'm just waiting for a score to come out that's mostly saxophones, because we haven't heard too much from the saxophones since the 80s.
Yeah. And you love saxophones yourself, right?
I do like saxophones. I think they're an amazingly agile and interesting instrument.
And sorry to bring you back to the taiga drama, but how much music did you write?
Well, we wrote over 7 hours of music, or I wrote over 7 hours of music, and we recorded it and mixed it and slaved over it. So it was really something. I spent weeks and weeks working from 5 a.m. until midnight, and not getting really any sleep for months at a time. It was pretty draining and exhausting. In fact, you can't see me on the podcast, but I'm actually only 33, and look at me. So,
oh, right. Nice. And how do you write 7 hours of music? No, so
well, that's a really good question. I think that's where one of the things that happens when you first start writing music, the very first score you do, you have all these ideas about what you want to do that you've been thinking about maybe for years, and you put them all out there, and your first score is your first score. But after you get through on the taiga drama, after you get through the first hour of music for any kind of series, you're out of those ideas. The preconceived ideas you might have had when you came to the project are exhausted. So that's where I do think you have to just reach into your own experience as a human being. And so if there's a death, you either think about, in my case, I've had a few family members die. If you really go for the honest feelings of sadness and loss and reach for what's in you. Likewise, when you see children, I mean, I've been lucky to have children and a happy family, and there are plenty of, I just finished a romantic comedy for Netflix called The Royal Treatment, and that has children in it, it has love, it has romance, and some of it is, it's rom-com stuff, so some of it is not 100% realistic, but nevertheless, I feel that you really have to put, as a composer, who you are into the score. How you really feel when you see someone that you love, or when you feel the loss of someone that was dear to you, or when you think of being frightened, sure, or in a dangerous situation. So that's one of the things that writing 7 hours of music for a single project pulls out of you, is that you just can't rely on what you did before or what you did last week. You have to come up with new things, and they have to be sincere, or the audience can detect it.
Yeah. And do you use, for example, like leitmotifs?
Well, that sort of depends on the project. I mean, you see, I do. And one of the reasons why I've enjoyed working in East Asia, China, South Korea, Japan, is that the melody is really quite popular there. And having a tune for a character is a perfectly acceptable way to score. You do see vogues come and go about that. Right now, I would say there's an aversion to melody as such. And if you go to the movies or you see stuff when streaming, you can hear some scores like the sort of superhero universe. They tend to have melodies, but there are a lot of dramas these days that really avoid it, and it's just little cells of notes rather than an actual melody or a leitmotif, as you mentioned, George.
Or just drones or soundscapes.
Or something really static. drones are very popular, and drones can be very effective for an individual scene. They create a sense that something's happening, a little bit of seriousness, a little bit of drama. But drones can really backfire. If you have a static harmonic, and certainly if you have a static rhythmic, or an absence of rhythm, after this scene and that scene and the next scene, after a while, the audience is like checking their watches. You really have to think about creating enough energy to keep the story moving. And I think that you'll see movies, even really good movies with big stars, sometimes they go too far into the sound design land without having a pulse or without having a melody or anything really to shove the story along.
But this is, again, as you said, mostly something that's popular right now in Europe and the United States, I would say. So, for example,
it's not in East Asia.
Yeah. China, for example, we've recorded also products in China. They also like to keep like lush melodies, even melodies that we might think from our perspective as over the top, like the ones that were used in Hollywood.
Intrusive, as like interfering with the dialogue or something like that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But you're right. I've actually been on a Chinese project that I can't really talk in detail about, but for since the beginning of last year, I'm still on that. And they want music. They don't want just drones and sound effects and soundscape. Mm. So I love that. And they also really want an acoustic sound for the most part for this particular project.
Yeah. Well, that's I think from our point of view as composers, this working with live musicians and having people perform your music, opposed to like having a synthesizer perform it, kind of gives us that human touch. That, at least from my perspective, the ability to work with other people and create something together. That's
it's just magic. I mean, you get a solo cellist, and you ask this cellist to play beauty, or you ask the cellist to play sadness, or you ask the cellist to play an ache or a longing. They know just what you're talking about, even if they don't speak the same language as you. It doesn't matter. Music reaches right past language barriers. It reaches right past all the sophistication that people have nowadays and all the knowledge they have, and goes right to your heart. And there's nothing like having, even if you can only afford a small string section or a small wind section, having something live is absolutely vital to convincing the audience and to marrying the live living performances of the actors to the music.
That's funny because maybe more than 15 years ago, I was a member on Sounds Online forums. And since I was using a lot of East-West instruments at the time and couldn't afford anything to record live, I was actually teaching myself how to make like a solo violin blend with the East-West samples, and I found some ways to do it at the time. And I've actually written also tutorials on that topic of adding some live instruments, even like a single instrument to your...
Even just one. It makes a huge difference.
Yeah, that's right.
But you're right, George, that there's some sort of tricks of the trade as to how you do that. And you want to write something that's either very conspicuous and very upfront as a solo instrument with soloistic figures and whatnot in it, or you want to record it in such a way that it actually does blend in. If you put the microphone 2 feet away from the violin, it's not going to blend in with a 18 violin sample set. So you have to know what you're doing.
Yeah, especially in my case where I had the Symphonic Orchestra Gold, which was only, I think, the
tree
silver.
mics.
Yeah, or only the tree mics, so no close mics.
Yeah. Well, one of the issues that you can run into is, especially as a young composer, is you don't really get the chance for a long time to write for live players because you don't either have the time or the budget, and in some cases the knowledge. People can go through an entire composing program and really hardly get anything played live, unless they're in a grad school or something something like that. So, but don't neglect it. It's a skill that especially if you're at a very low level and then you get a little bit higher level and a little higher level, and all of a sudden they look at you and say, okay, where's the orchestra? So it's really a good idea if you're a young composer and you want to go somewhere with it and you want to be ambitious about it, to at least start learning how to work with live players, how to communicate with them, how to keep them happy, how to explain when you're not getting what you want, and you think it's obvious, not to get frustrated or, God forbid, angry or lose your temper with the players. That doesn't help at all. So you've got to keep everybody on the same side, because you are on the same side. The conductor is your helper. The players are your helpers. The copyists, the orchestrators, the person who's in the booth, the person operating the Pro Tools. You need all of those people. That's one of the wonderful things about music, but it's a skill that you have to develop. You can't just assume that everybody will do what you say because you're paying them. That just is not a good attitude.
And it's easy to go the other route, to become angry and frustrated, because after all, nowadays the composer also serves the role as some sort of a executive producer. So you have to take care about a lot of things. And when you have the clock ticking and the deadline, very close to you, and this, like, the noose getting tighter and tighter on your neck,
yes,
it's easy to get
like
frustrated.
That. Yeah, and you're under a lot of pressure, and it's really tense. But saying please and saying thank you and being courteous with people and say, well, I hear what you're doing there. That's beautiful, but it's not quite what I want. I want a little more aggressive or a little bit more edge on the bow. You have to make sure that you're acknowledging that you're working with a person. And because one of the hazards of working with computers for week after week after week, and all by yourself, is you can get as frustrated as you want with your samples. They don't mind.
Yes.
But then when you come to the players, you want to remember to be a good person, good gal, good guy, whatever it is. And just remember that everybody's there trying to make your music sound as good as possible. And the best way to make that happen is to be speedy but courteous and listen to what they're saying and what they're trying to bring to it as well.
Sure. And how did you learn yourself?
Well, I came through in the days. I learned how to orchestrate by working on Warner Brothers cartoons, Tiny Toon Adventures, and Sylvester and Tweety Mysteries, and there were a bunch of other shows that a friend of mine, Eric Schmidt, who's the composer on some of those shows, brought me in on, like a bunch of other guys too. So in those days, you'd go to Warner Brothers and you'd have an orchestra. Sometimes it was pretty small, 26, 30 people. Sometimes it's pretty huge. And you would actually get to hear back every week what the players, what your orchestration sounded like.
Yeah.
So one of the things I have to say I learned was I was way too timid. Because when you're in university or in high school or something, or you just don't have that much money and you're hiring amateurs, they can't really play that well. The ranges of the brass, for example, are quite constrained. And the amount of the speed that they can play at and the meters that they change from 7/8 to 2/4 back and forth all the time. All that kind of stuff can be difficult. Then when you get studio players, you find out they can play practically anything you can imagine.
Yes.
They're so good. And so I guess I sometimes still feel that I'm overcautious, but I'm a lot less cautious than I used to be.
Yeah. And when you orchestrated, how did you do that in those days? Did you work from a piano?
In those days you had a pencil and paper and click tracks, and but like literally stopwatches. It was that far back. But and it was very cumbersome and silly, but I'm still grateful to it, because it meant that I had no choice but to learn how to write for live players. And the first movie I worked on is called Full Contact, the first feature. Yeah. And it was an incredibly low budget movie. And I had absolutely no idea what the genre was like and all, but I hired some cellos and a little rhythm section, and it's just amazing. Even 4 cellos can sound they can sound magic. So get some live players. Whatever you do, get at least some live players, or a singer or a a percussionist or something.
What a jump, from for not that big of a like time difference you get from writing on a pen and paper to Sibelius or Finale or Dorico, bursting out parts and scores that can be even printed during the session. This is
it's absolutely amazing. And it used to be that you had a whole room full of people, and watching them copy parts in the old days, it was incredible. They could listen to another piece of music on headphones and write your parts out and never make any mistakes.
Wow.
So those guys are amazing.
Well, this is something that, for example, we didn't have, even though I'm, young to, unfortunately for me, I was born in 1989. So I missed some of the good parts of recording films here in my country.
But I think a lot of people did. So I think, George, your experience is much more like that of a young composer today, in that things are not done manually by and large. And so you have to ask yourself, well, if what I want to end up with, if the place I want to end up in the end is with a great big orchestra and all the bells and whistles and synths and guitars and choirs and all that, how do I get there? And you're not going to get there by working solely with samples. You really have to learn to incorporate players, the breathing, the ranges, the difficulties, the making sure that you don't change tempo abruptly in the middle of a bar, things like that.
Absolutely,
You have to learn what the problems are that you can inadvertently generate for yourself. And so one of the things, luckily, is that you can buy scores now. There's a wonderful score, How to Train Your Dragon. There's a great big book of Lord of the Rings that has many excerpts in it. There are John Williams scores available. And so you can see how those guys do it. And it's dazzling.
One of the things that I want to try myself one of these days, if I have if the budget allows for it, is that normally I always record something for the scores I'm doing, but it's always to click. And back in the days, especially in Hollywood, obviously here in Bulgaria we don't know what like punches and streamers are, but back in those days you would get the picture and you would actually conduct to the film and make it more like lively. So I would love to try this one of these days, even though it's probably been lost as a technique. I don't know. Do you know anyone that works like this?
There is still at least one digital audio workstation program, Digital Performer, that allows you to put in streamers and punches. And there's a very famous story about that for the movie E.T., which came out a very long time ago, 1984. But it's a very popular score written by John Williams. And there's a big scene where there's a lot of flying around and a lot of chases and magical things happening. And John Williams famously recorded it 3 or 4 times, and then it still wasn't exactly to picture because of the streamers and the punches. He's as good a conductor as you'll ever see, but he didn't get absolutely everything, and they ended up re-editing the picture because the performance was so good of the music that they didn't want to mess with that. So that's Steven Spielberg, who loves music, clearly.
That's right.
And but there is this ebb and flow without a click that you just can't ever get with a click. The other thing that I think is a mistake is to use the same meter over and over and over again, and also just to have a rigid tempo from beginning to end of a cue. It's really helpful to have the tempo ebb and flow a little bit, even if you have to do it with clicks.
Because normally if the conductor is performing a piece, they'll make a slight ritardando, then they'll get back to tempo primo to the initial tempo, but it won't be exactly the same. And this kind of gives the life of the music.
It does. You're absolutely right, George.
And when we speak about composing and orchestration, what's your conducting as well, performing? What's the most interesting part for you out of this, the thing that you do? Because you kind of do all those things yourself.
Well, I guess every once in a while, I see everyone's probably heard of Philip Glass, the famous
Yeah.
composer. He's most famous for his operas and his oratorios and concert music, but he's also written some film scores. He has a very interesting video of he's just standing in his house and being interviewed, and he compares writing music to waking up early when it's still dark on a misty morning, and you look out the window and you really can't see that much. You maybe see some gray shapes, some forms, and then the sun is gradually coming up and you start to see a little bit more detail. You can see, oh, that's a tree, and that's a barn, or that's a car out there. And then as the light comes in, you see more and more. Now you can see some leaves and you can see some branches. And after a while, you can really see everything. And for me, that is a very, as it is for Philip Glass, apparently, that's a great metaphor for composing. Sometimes you just sort of grope around for a while until you stumble across something that becomes more and more clear to you, and you become more and more confident as you go along. And I think it's that feeling of finally bumping into something that's really going to be meaningful to you and hopefully to the audience. And as it gets clarified, it's a really exciting moment. I do like conducting because I like the players, and they're often very funny. And sometimes you get in front of players and you think, wow, these guys are really good. I should have written something better than this.
Yeah.
But I think the composing process and that discovery, George, for me is the most exciting thing.
Yeah. I don't know for myself. I like composing, but I also like orchestration, and
Sure.
especially, and in my experience, they kind of go in together hand by hand.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I can't.
You really can't separate them.
Yeah. But I also, one of the interesting things that occurred to me a few years back, I've actually been meaning to kind of put this into a more like structured thought and make something more detailed out of this idea. But when I was studying in the academy here of in Sofia, Music Academy, I was obviously composing during that time. I even did a period drama TV series that's very popular here in Bulgaria.
Oh, that's great.
And I always had this frustration when I was writing the music, because every time something wasn't sounding right. And to me, that was like, oh, that's a poor composition. Then this turned out to be like, you know what, that's poor mixing. And only when I finished, my studies as a choir conductor, I actually found out that what's bugging me was that nowadays when we write the music into the digital audio workstation, we kind of become the conductors and the first performers of our own music. And you as a composer, you write the notes and everything, but you also have to conduct and give those notes some meaning. So then I started actually writing and performing the music on the MIDI, just playing through with with the samples, but actually thinking about how they will be performed in a live scenario. And that actually gave me good idea about what's being done in the workstation. It's not just staccato and mercato.
But part of the reason why you're able to do that, George, is that I know that you're also a player and a conductor yourself, and you know how to perform. And that's another thing, along with writing for live players, is don't neglect your own practice. Just about every great composer that I can think of plays at least one instrument really very, very well. Yeah. And whether that's James Newton Howard or Hans Zimmer or some of the younger guys who are more keyboard players or guitar players, every one of them can play something really well. The famous concert composer John Adams was a virtuoso clarinet player, for example. So it doesn't have to be even a traditional instrument. My first instrument was alto saxophone. And the alto saxophone is really not used in the symphony very much.
Yeah. Hence the love for saxophones.
That's it. More saxophones. But still, you have to be able to think, as you were describing, how is the player going to handle this passage? And what kind of click is actually going to work so that she can, play this beautiful flute melody that I've written? Because sometimes it's really hard to do all of that at once. You're sight reading, you might have a lot of notes to play, especially if it's a woodwind, and you have to make it easier for the flute player. So one of the things that you learn as an orchestrator when you're working for other people is, when you want to change tempo, it's good to have a note that's held for 4 or 5 beats at the new tempo, so they can hear the click change while they're holding a note, rather than maybe doing a crescendo. It's not like they're doing nothing, but they don't have to suddenly jump into a new tempo with no warning.
Yes, yeah, which makes it for a more musical and also gives you a less stressful environment during a recording session.
Yes, yeah. That's right, because the players are under a tremendous amount of stress, and the last thing you want to do is clumsily add to that stress. The other thing, you mentioned orchestration. Orchestration is really an art all by itself. And one of the things that you learn after a while is that an orchestration is like a house of cards. So that if you change one thing, sometimes it absolutely wrecks the entire structure. So if you have a producer who doesn't like the bassoon or whatever, some instrument that you've put in there, and they say, well, I really don't like that sound. What is that sound? So you have to kind of do what they say to some extent, but sometimes you pull out one line and it just, you're missing the wrong notes of the chord. It just doesn't sound right anymore.
That's right.
So orchestration is really it's a huge topic and really a fun one, actually.
I had a director on a feature film that I did 1 or 2 years back.
Mm-hmm.
And when I got the gig, so I did some demo tracks and stuff, which is something that I also wanted to talk to you about in a minute. But, I got the gig, so I started writing, and then the director comes in and I'm like, okay, so let's talk a bit more about the story, about the characters. So that's the most important part for me. And he was like, sure, that's important. But for me, the most important part is don't use any flutes. Why? He was like, I hate flutes. So no flutes in the soundtrack. Everything else. Now let's talk about the characters. That was
I had something like that where the director said, I hate the clarinet. I don't know why he hates the clarinet. So we get to the recording session and all the players come in, and the oboe player makes an entrance, and the director loses his mind and says, I told you I hate the clarinet. And you can understand a non-musician confusing them. They're both black, they're both woodwinds, but they're really not the same. And anyway, luckily the player could play the clarinet, and so he took the line on a clarinet and transposed it in real time. But you get stuff like that all the time. Or, oh my God, you put in electric guitar. I don't like electric guitar. It's like, well, we don't have any brass, so we better have something loud. So learn to love it.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
And and you've worked with on video games and on feature films. So nowadays, do you do demos, like demo submissions for different projects, or how do you approach your?
There's really only a handful of people out there who don't have to provide demos to get a job, and I've heard all kinds of approaches to that. I usually use electronics, but one of my friends will hire a full brass section, record, get parts copied, the whole thing, if he wants to work on especially a TV series, because first of all, it's incredibly competitive. And if you get the job, it can be very lucrative. So he feels it's definitely worth it, and it sets him apart. But, if we're talking about how to pitch for a gig, honestly, the way you get gigs is so haphazard and crazy. You get gigs for totally arbitrary reasons, and you lose gigs for totally arbitrary reasons. Yes. And it seems like, at least in LA, the best way to get a gig is to, play tennis with somebody or go out for too many drinks with them or something. I mean, it has nothing to do with being a great composer. It's much more about having the decision maker be comfortable with you, that you care about the project, that you're a good person, that you're reliable, that you don't have some kind of health or other impediment to doing a good job. They're all the things that as a composer you might not even think of, but imagine you're now the director and you have to think, who am I going to trust with this project that sometimes they've been working on for 10 years?
Yeah.
They wrote it, they rewrote it, they submitted it, they got, they finally get it greenlit, they got it cast, they got it shot, and now they have to deal with somebody new all of a sudden. And sometimes it depends on the director. I've worked with one director who plays the piano so well he can play piano concertos, but that would be the rare exception. Most producers and directors are not musicians, and in some cases they're really kind of uncomfortable about music. They know all about story, they know all about acting, they know about lighting, they know about cameras, lenses, all that stuff, but they don't necessarily feel that comfortable with music. So part of your effort getting a job is just conveying to the person that you're going to do the absolute best you can, and that when there's a difference of opinion, you're going to work it out in a professional but creative way.
Yeah. And you also, part of your job becomes also to educate, maybe, in a certain
Sometimes.
sense. Yeah.
But
that, at the end, it's not in their job to, understand music, because they're like directors and people who are working with film. But you're right.
Nevertheless, I think you're right, George, that being a little bit of an educator at times can help the person feel more that he or she is in control of the situation.
Yeah.
And less that they just have to trust you. Saying just trust me is fine if you're established, but if you're not at all established, just trust me that's a tough sell.
Yeah. And what about video games? You've worked on video games?
I have worked on a number of video games, and I really like working on video games. But the big difference between video games and film, whether it's TV or movies or a short or something, is that the timeline is not locked. So there's no the rhythm of the scene. If it's a video game, is typically set by the player, not by you as the composer. So one of the things you have to look for other sources of inspiration that are not necessarily going to be available to you, because sometimes all you get is a few still images. You don't even get a scene to work on. And you just have to imagine it or think of playing video games yourself. It doesn't hurt to, play a few video games and actually get the sense of how they work yourself. And one of the things that they'll be wanting to know is, do you understand how to create enough stems so that if someone gets stuck on level 2 for 3 days, he doesn't hear just the exact same track 3,000 times.
Sure, yeah. So this means that the projects that you've worked on are mostly adaptive music. Is that right? Or
in the video games, yes.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Sometimes you'll write a little vignette where there'll be like a 30 second or a minute and a half of, people call them different things, but interstitial, or just like a film segment where it is more like a little short movie or like a bridge to the next level or something like that. So sometimes you do, for a video game, write to picture.
Yeah. And do you understand a lot about like Wise or F-mod or?
Well, I don't. I don't pay so much attention to that. And I've been getting hired on video games really for my musical sensibility, not for a huge detailed technical thing. But I'm like everybody, you learn as much technology as you need to learn, and for a video game, typically what you want to do is make sure that you think, okay, how is this scene going to end? And how do I cut off the music so that I'm not relying on a ring out or some musical device that's just not going to be available in the game? That said, the people that do the sound for video games are absolute wizards. It is such a deep topic, and they can usually work with whatever you give them. They're absolutely amazing.
I remember I was when I was in school, I was under the apprenticeship of local composer called Borislav Slavov. Not sure if you know him. Mm-hmm. And back at that time, he did a game called Knights of Honor, which is it's an amazing soundtrack and an amazing game.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I started working with him. So this is actually the second time I'm speaking about him on this podcast. So yeah, weird. But one thing that I remember is that he gave me a book. He gave me like the manual of FMod and said, you know what, you need to read this and learn it. And I just couldn't get past page 15 or something. Yeah. And so far,
sure, I read it, boss.
Yeah.
Yeah, I got it all right up here, right up here.
Yeah, and I never actually learned. It's funny because nowadays I'm working also on the sampling side of things and doing virtual instruments, which are kind of similar to to this. It involves some scripting and some faking and EQ and effects.
Yep.
But back at that time, I want to write music. I just want to write music. Yeah.
Well, I have seen people post online that you have to learn this and you have to learn that and you have to do all these other things. But here's what I think in the end. Write great music. If you write great music, people will work with you. If you can't be a silly person about it, or a diva or vain or a goofball. If you act like you're somebody important, that doesn't really wash too well. But if you write great music, they will work with you and they'll find a way around it. And they'll find a guy who has read the FMod manual and knows how it actually works.
There is, again, something that came out of a conversation that we had today is that as composers, we're actually blessed to be working on something. And this is me going back to what you said about doing the music that is special and music that is actually creative and with some of yourself as an artist woven into it. And so we are blessed as composers because we get this IP, this intellectual property right of stuff that can become more valuable in the future. And that's I would say some sort of an investment to invest in yourself as an artist, maybe, because after 15 years of doing something and just writing, as you said, good music and stuff that people like and love, it becomes part of your legacy.
Well, I feel the same way. One of the questions that people sort of say is, well, why don't you write concert music like symphonies and operas and that kind of thing? Because your stuff is, as a media composer, if it's video games or movies or television or something, your music is married to something that, of course, at some point will become so out of date and old fashioned that it's no longer watched or viewed. And so it's just a miracle if you get to work once in a while on something that doesn't get dated. And there just aren't too many of those projects. But I guess I do think I take huge satisfaction in trying to write and occasionally succeeding in writing something that people really love and embrace, and where millions and millions of people have enjoyed it and experienced it with you. And so it's incredibly gratifying. And I do think it's a great gift that we have as composers.
Yeah. Do you like when you see the communication going back from people who actually loved your music, when you see, for example, comments online? And
it's really gratifying and honestly charming. One of the things about the taiga drama, because of its popularity, is there are quite a few amateur musicians who, within days of the first airing of the first episode, had posted YouTube videos of themselves playing the main theme.
That's awesome.
Taken down by ear. And so some of them were little children. Some of them were small ensembles, a string quartet. There's one young woman who played 4 different violin parts that she had obviously arranged herself, and many, many versions played on synthesizer. And when you see that clear response to what you've done, it's really heartening. And it also, for me, here's how I come to it. I am trying to tap into something honest and sincere in myself and what I think is part of being human when I write. And when you see that kind of response, you think, okay, well, at least I got some part of that. I did okay with some part of it.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. So it is really reassuring, and it's nice to get indirectly the feedback.
So yeah, my last question for today was asking you what the most important lesson you wish you had was, but I think that we kind of already answered this in this talk.
I think we did, but I guess to me, remembering to be a good person and not let ambition eat you alive. We live in a world where you see people who do fairly trivial things making lots and lots of money, and you see people who do great things or very difficult things, sometimes not making very much at all. And it can be confusing and make you think that, oh, the world is all about ego and flash and superficiality. But actually, I don't think it is. And I think the same ingredients that make you a good spouse or a good parent or a good child or a good colleague to work with, all those things, don't forget those things. Those are all important in making a life for yourself as a composer, because, you know, this gig or that gig, no one gig is going to make that much of a difference. And turning yourself into, remembering to be a good person is much more important. If you turn yourself into a monster, but you get a few gigs, you haven't done anybody any favors, including yourself.
That's right. And when you get to a recording with other people, with live musicians,
mm-hmm.
if you're a nice person, they will also kind of transfer this to the music they play.
They will, and they will really try to help. And if there's a difficult passage, instead of just saying, well, that guy's kind of a jerk, I guess I'll just do the best I can and not worry about it. They might make a suggestion that says, well, you know, I could play it this way, but there's another way to play it that would be a little easier, that will probably sound a little better. They'll really help you.
Sure.
They'll really help you. And so be nice to them. And so in a way, that's not very altruistic, because it's kind of like, well, I get something for that. But it's also just more enjoyable to have a pleasant session with players that are happy and they feel good about themselves when they walk out the door, as does the conductor and the orchestrator and the recording team. It just makes life better.
Yeah. And since it's a very collaborative industry, you know,
mm-hmm.
no composer likes when the director is actually very arrogant and behaves in not the most mature way, or is being outright aggressive. And at the end, when we work with other musicians, we kind of become the directors of them.
Yeah. So don't be that guy.
Don't be that guy, and write good music. John, thank you so much for being on this podcast. It's been a pleasure.
Well, it's always nice to see you, George, and thank you for inviting me, and best of luck to you. I know you have some new projects coming along, some new libraries on the horizon, and I look forward to hearing all about those when they're public.
Thank you. Cheers.